The United Nations is under increasing financial stress. Some UN member states fail to pay what they owe, limiting the UN's ability to operate efficiently. It faces a combined shortfall of nearly $2 billion for peacekeeping operations and its regular budget. The problem is so severe that UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres says he wishes he could sell his official residence in central New York City. The greatest cause of this shortfall is the United States, which owes the UN $1.1 billion. To be fair, the US is expected to pay up to 28% of the UN's peacekeeping operations, but wants to pay no more than 25%. Is the US dragging its feet in order to pay a little less? What would be the consequences for the UN itself? I'm joined in Brussels by Fraser Cameron, director of the EU Asia Center, a Brussels-based research policy think tank, and from Washington, D.C., Steve Pruitt, managing partner at Watts Partners and former staff director of the U.S. House Congressional Budget Committee. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. So, as I said, as of January the 1st this year, the U.S. owed $1.1 billion. This is a number of the United Nations, but has been confirmed by the U.S. mission to the UN, and the United States is the only country in the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council which has not paid up. So, Steve, exactly what's causing the US to drag its feet on this matter?
Well, first I think you have to appreciate that debating the U.S. contribution to the UN has been a long and ugly, if you will, exercise that the U.S. has gone through for years. Back in the 80s, I can remember days when literally the debate came to a standstill over the partisan split between whether or not to pay and what to pay the United Nations. And ensuing administrations since the early 80s have all tried to bring about significant and intangible budget reform at the UN, basically to allow the U.S. to reallocate, if not realign, some of their foreign assistance spending. So it's not new. It will continue this year. My prognosis, however, is that the budget situation in the United States is probably going to put us in a posture where we may make some dent in the arrearage amount that's still there at the UN, but I don't see them actually coming up with a budget that would support a full payment of the $1.6 billion, I believe it is. That's just a lot of money that there are other U.S.-based demands for right now. And I don't think that the Congress, even as liberal, if you will, as they may view funding for the UN, is going to go that far.
Mr. Cameron, I mean, we understood this is not the first time that the U.S. has not paid in full in time. Do you see this year's situation particularly outstanding compared to previous years?
Slightly, but I mean, as the previous speaker said, the U.S. has history on this. It has often used the threat of withholding payments to get changes, both not only in its budget contributions, but also in specific policies. More recently, in terms of restrictions on birth control policies, linking it to reduction in aid going to Palestine, for example. So this is not something that's particularly new, but it is more serious than we've seen in recent years. Plus the fact that there's no great advocate for the UN in the US administration. I mean, John Bolton, who's the National Security Advisor and a former US ambassador to the UN, is on record as questioning the validity of the whole organization. So with friends like that, you're not really going to get a powerful lobby to push for full implementation of payment.
Well, we try to answer this question exactly. How does the UN concretely benefit the United States, or how has the UN benefited the United States? There are at least this 2014 UN impact report which shows that the fact that the headquarters of the United Nations is in New York, it generated about $3.7 billion in total economic output annually, and that some 16,000 people are directly employed. But Steve, are Americans or some American politicians going to look at the benefit of the United Nations from the economic benefit it generates for a city?
Well, the short answer is no. I think that's a less impactful factor in the debate that's going on. What you're seeing is more of a geopolitical discussion that is occurring not only in the U.S. as it relates to the United Nations, but in terms of the U.S. role in the world. I mean, there are many who would argue that the Trump administration's America First thematic approach to foreign affairs has really seen us stepping back from a lot of the activities, responsibilities that we have historically taken as an attempt to, again, so-called make America great again. Now, while that is may play well within the president's political base, within the larger world environment, it's problematic on a number of fronts. It is a problem that is going to cost us for years in terms of our involvement on the world stage. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, what we're looking at is a diminution of American leadership throughout the world. So I think the UN is just a small part of that discussion, and unfortunately, it's an impactful one.
Mr. Cameron, how do you look? How would you explain to people, to the ordinary Pau and Gao on the streets in the United States or anywhere else, that the UN, as bureaucratic, as slow or inefficient as it may seem, it is an organization that is indispensable to the development of the world?
Well, it's quite a difficult argument to make, given the way successive administrations have tended to downplay, if not denigrate, the UN. I mean, the argument that you suggested about showing the economic benefits of just simply having the UN in New York has never been used, and I don't think it really would have much resonance. I think the argument to make is, look, if you didn't have the UN to actually mitigate some of the worst conflicts in the world and pick up the pieces, you would actually be spending more money in the end trying to do that. You just look at the aftermath of wars in the Middle East and Syria and Iraq, Afghanistan, etc. You would be spending more money. So I think, in terms of a rational cost-benefit analysis, you could make the case that the UN actually saves the US and other countries money.
Well, President Trump's position on the UN has been, for instance, he talked about the UN for a club for people who have a good time. Mr. Pompeo talked about last December, he questioned if UN continues to serve its mission faithfully, and in the 2018 budget proposal, President Trump requested cutting more than half of the U.S.'s funding to UN programs, including all contributions to climate change programs. The Congress largely rejected the proposed cuts, but it did put a cap on peacekeeping operations from 28% to 25%. So, Steve, you were former staff director of the U.S. House Congressional Budget Committee. What is the consideration of the Congress, still asking the U.S. to go ahead with a payment, but paying less for the peacekeeping operations?
Well, I would encourage all of us to take a moment and differentiate between the rhetoric that comes from the administration and ultimately what Congress will do. If you look at the congressional players who are involved in this exercise, there are people who had many years more experience than the President, Secretary Pompeo, and others in the administration in dealing with the issues related to not only foreign policy, but U.S. involvement in the United Nations. So they understand, I think, the significance and the importance of the United Nations. They will do the very best that they can to try and keep the U.S. funding the programs that the UN pursues in a meaningful way. But again, a lot of the discussion about budget reform and putting the caps on overall spending is part of essentially a long-term frustration of not being able to see a process out of the United Nations that, quite frankly, parodies what we do in the United States in terms of setting a budget, setting spending limits, and then having enforcement measures to keep that spending in line. The fact that the UN budget process is bifurcated between their annual budget as well as their midterm review and allocations, which arguably is necessary given the fact that they're responding to world events on a regular basis. It's just too much of a debate here in the U.S.
Okay. Mr. Cameron, what's the position of European countries, of the other permanent, for instance, France and Germany, when it comes to payment into their contribution to the United Nations? Is there any hesitation? Is there any bargaining about how much they should pay, how much they shouldn't?
No, the Brits have also been a prominent member of the Fifth Committee, which looks after UN finances, and they, like the US, Germany, other large contributors, have also been very rigorous in terms of examining programs. But I think you will find all the EU member states, and plus the contribution that the EU makes itself, always has been paid on time. I think partly to set a good example to the US and others, because there is this growing concern in Europe about whether the traditional commitment of the United States to most international organizations, not just the UN. I mean, the big concern in Europe just now is the WTO, is whether this administration is really committed to upholding and maintaining these institutions, many of which, of course, the United States helped found.
Yeah, exactly. The United States helped founded the United Nations during the Second World War. Final question, my final question. I understand that the US will eventually pay, whether in full or not, and the United Nations will continue to exist, thank God. But when the United States is paying less, it's going to expect its influence on things inside that system diminish. Steve, do you think the U.S. is ready to see that kind of consequence? Because as the U.S. is trying to cap its input, China is actually expanding its contribution and will continue to do so over the long run.
Well, I'm not sure that I would agree with the construct that you just laid out. I think under current discussions in the United States, the fact that $1 is going to the UN would probably equate to the power of $10 worth of influence, quite frankly. I don't think that this administration views that in the same perspective. Secondly, I think it's important to note that even though we have an administration in place, we have the equivalent of term limits in America. We're either going to have a change of administrations in about 2 years, or certainly over the long term 6 years. In terms of world affairs, that's only a second on the time clock. So this too will pass. We will get through this somehow, some way, and hopefully we'll be able to continue to contain the world so that we don't implode. Okay, let's wait and see. Many thanks to my guests, Fraser Cameron joining us from Brussels and Steve Pruitt joining us from Washington, D.C. And with that, we come to the end of this edition of The Point with me, Lu Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show on your mobile devices. Stay there.